Bank runs, debt deals, wars on crypto. If the dollar's so weak, why is it laughing at us? The economic crisis has everyone sweating but the people in charge. How do we change that? Visionary VC Balaji Srinivasan is here to break it down. Hopefully, before the financial system breaks down. I'm James Poulos. You're watching 0 Hour. If you've spent any time in, on, or around the liberty movement, you're probably well familiar with the term fiat currency, like fiat lux in the Latin translation of God's creative utterance in the book of Genesis, "Let there be light." If the power to tax is the power to destroy, jumping forward to the present day, then the destructive act of government par excellence, at least for the dollar skeptics, must be fiat bucks. Let there be greenbacks, backed by nothing but, cough cough, the full faith and credit of the United States government. Some say the solution is a return to the gold standard, some look to Bitcoin or different cryptocurrencies. Still others embrace the ethos that everything's a scam, banking on the unknowable possibilities of chaos and anarchy to break the logjam of infinite money printing, endless inflation, and the perverse incentives and abuses of power that flow therefrom. Unfortunately for you and me, the government doing the quote-unquote printing is far in the rearview mirror. Today's federal money system amounts to a massive Borg, ruthlessly confident in the futility of our resistance and its ability to assimilate us all into one global financial and economic regime, controlled by fiat the way an autocrat runs a country, if the autocrat was a vast network of often invisible machines. The Borg bucks promulgated by this omnivorous techno-beast aren't exactly backed by warm fuzzies and happy thoughts the way fiat currency has been in the pre-digital age. They're backed by us, our data, our compliance, our integration like battery packs into a closed, compulsory, and comprehensive system. For all the well-intentioned worry over the spooky future of central bank digital currencies, we're effectually there already, with the Fed, Treasury, and the SEC working seamlessly to consolidate the banking system into the new digitized governance system and stamp out any outliers and alternatives, all but daring the opposition to pass state-level legislation preserving monetary freedom and seeing how they do in the courts. Well, so be it. Implied in the First and Second Amendments to the U.S. Constitution is a right to keep digital arms and use them. Not just the high-powered GPUs you need for an epic gaming computer, but the Bitcoin you can use right now to build new economic and cultural institutions, free from the Borg and protective of what we cherish, our constitutionally guaranteed form of government, our hard-earned way of life, and our humanity itself. If Congress can't make that explicit and head off Borg bucks tyranny, states can, and you can probably guess which ones. And because in a republic, politics doesn't move at the speed of bits, we've got to walk and chew gum at the same time, building the new and better system at the same time we ready ourselves for the collapse, the overreach, or just the pure hostility of the current one. Here to lay out the state of play and what you can do about it, we've got Balaji Srinivasan beaming in from half a world away. Balaji. He's an angel investor, a tech founder, and a Wall Street Journal best-selling author of The Network State. You can see it at networkstate.com, formerly the CTO of Coinbase and general partner at Andreessen Horowitz. He's an early investor in many successful tech companies, much too long to list. I'm sure he can talk about them if he wants to. Balaji, it's great to have you here from so far away to dig in, so let's get to it.
Great to be here, James.
All right, so lay this out for us. You've been talking a lot about the fiat crisis lately. It's a sort of omni-crisis involving multiple layers of federal institutions, government agencies, and just plain old pillars of the economy. Where do things stand as of right now, and where's the pressure point?
So the financial system is intentionally complicated, but in one line, treasuries are the new toxic waste. So if you remember how mortgage-backed securities were the toxic waste of the 2008 crash, these things that everybody thought were safe, they thought were AAA, and were actually not. And, people were in denial all the way up to the top. And it was anti-American, to question whether, people wouldn't pay their mortgages. That was the American dream. I can't believe you would say that the housing market could ever go down. Housing only goes up. Some combination of wishful thinking, of complicated jargon, of fake ratings, of people trying to find a greater fool, and actually a federal pressure, because both the Bush and the Clinton administrations push banks to extend mortgages to people who didn't have the ability to pay. For example, there's a 2008 article like Bush Drive for Home Ownership fueled mortgage bubble. And then there's also articles on how the Clinton administration fueled a housing crisis. And that's like, you can get a binocular vision when you look at both the left and the right, and the right will criticize the left will criticize the right, and you can kind of put it together there. So the point is that just like the 2008 crisis, which was in part government caused and certainly in part bank caused, and in part wishful thinking caused, we're on the brink of something, we're in the middle of something, frankly, that's even greater than that. In 2008, it was a banking crisis. We've got a central banking crisis. If in 2008, the crisis could be solved by the government stepping in and putting everything onto its own books, that's already happened. And so now the crisis extends to the currency itself, because another giant print on the scale of 2008 will not have the same effect, in the sense of it's going to have a much different effect with everybody tuned to look for it, and everybody's expectations wired differently. So that's the short version. Treasuries are the new toxic waste. Trust the Fed, end up dead. Fed lied, banks died. And I can go into detail.
Those catchphrases, bringing back memories. I feel like it's 2003 or so all over again. Different kinds of Americans have a different assessment of like where we started to go off the rails in earnest. Depending on how old the folks you're talking to, they might say, well, it was 2008, it was the financial crisis. Some might say like, well, no, actually it was like the .com, bubble bursting. That was the warning sign. Some will go back to, coming off the gold standard. Do you have a spot that you've pegged where it's like, okay, you follow the thread back and this is where things really started to go off the rails? Or is that less important to you at this point?
I mean, it's like a useful historical exercise to figure out when was the last point on the road that the car could have slowed down before flying off the cliff. It is a useful historical exercise. But right now, I think most people don't even understand that there's a cliff, or in some ways that we've already flown off it, and it's Wile E. Coyote, and we haven't looked down yet. So that's kind of where I'm at. With that said, just to engage your question, you can peg it to 1971. There's a site called What the F Happened in 1971, which says that's when the country went off the gold standard, and Nixon pulled us off the gold standard, and so on. And you can peg it to the 80s, which is when sort of deficit spending, that was a truce in a sense between right and left under Reagan. I mean, I think Reagan was a good president, but the combination of both tax cuts and increased spending satisfied both right and left at the expense of the future. And that truce continued for 40-something years, and now it's blowing up today because it's unsustainable in some sense. You can peg it all the way back to FDR. You can peg it all the way back to Lincoln's centralization of power. Some people will take it all the way back to 1789. I mean, there's always the roots of some crisis at the very beginning. But I think the most important thing right now is just to admit that it's happening.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think what's animating a lot of that kind of search for responsibility, I mean, you see it in something like in a totally different key, like 1619 Project, where it's like, where did the sin start leaching in?
Sure.
Right. But I think what's animating that really, in this case especially, is a sort of fear that this is something that's kind of out of our hands. There was nothing that we really could have done. We made a bunch of decisions that seemed like maybe the right thing to do at the time or necessary under the circumstances. And despite our best intentions, we end up with sort of like global thermonuclear financial meltdown. So, if this is just kind of a thing that happened to us, and yeah, people have responsibility, but they're, it's kind of buy the ticket, take the ride kind of deal. How do we make sure that if and when we do sort of like look down, have the hard landing, dust ourselves off like Wile E. Coyote always does, even if he has a bandage on his head? How do we make sure that we don't make the same mistakes or get us stuck in the same trap again?
Yeah. So, by the way, on the topic of 1619, two just quick comments on that. Somehow, the New York Times company, which published that, didn't mention that its own family, the Ox-Sulzbergers that own the New York Times company, own slaves, credibly reported by the New York Post in 2020. And they went all the way back to 1619, but not, for example, 1932 to 1933, when Walter Duranty, reporter for the New York Times, won a Pulitzer for covering up the mass starvation of 5 million Ukrainians. Now, today, of course, they've reinvented themselves as a cheerleader for Ukraine, which is a little bit like Der Stürmer becoming pro-Israel or something. And so I just want to say that, you know, the New York Times search for the real killers should end with their own office. It's actually remarkable how they've kind of covered up the Ox-Sulzberg, their own, you know, complicity in history.
Yeah, certainly hard to trust them on this stuff, even
right?
though they're trying to call the shots.
Yes, exactly. So, but then to your other question about, you know, dust off after the hard landing, I don't know if this is going to be a normal recession or something like that. I have a feeling that this, on top of, I'm more with Ray Dalio's camp, where this could be the final blow, you know, in the sense of we're talking about a historical level crisis of the currency in a background of extreme domestic political conflict and truly uncensored social media so people can get the story out, and significant global conflict and massive technological shocks, and huge diplomatic pulling away from the U.S. abroad. And all of that comes together because it's like, you know, Blue America is losing power domestically and abroad. You know, people try to separate domestic policy and foreign policy. But if you just think of it as one global internet network, the Blue Tribe is fighting both the Red Tribe, the conservatives, and the Gray Tribe of tech domestically. And it's fighting the Russians and the Chinese globally, but it's also fighting, in a sense, India and Israel and France and Brazil and so on, and even good chunks of its own center-left domestically. And so it's just fighting too many people at the same time.
Almost feels like Germany versus the world in the 20th century.
It's interesting you make that analogy, because the entire, you know, like Nazi thing lasted 1933 to 1945, and it peaked in like 1941 when it seemed like they had everything, but then they had a bandwagon effect where everybody piled on them and they lost, right? And so in the same way, wokeness may last 2013 to 2025, because it seemed like they peaked maybe in 2021, 2022, and then they invaded Russia or not invaded Russia, fought Russia, overcorrected. And now there's like a reverse bandwagon effect where on every front versus tech, arguably they're losing. Elon has, you know, uncensored Twitter. A lot of the tech people are much more outspoken, versus the right. Yes, they're gone after Trump personally, but Trumpism, or the sort of, what do you call it, awakened conservatism, however you want to talk about it, is bigger than him. And it doesn't live or die with him alone. So even if they're targeting somebody, it doesn't stop, quote, the movement anymore. Russia remains to be seen what happens there, but they didn't win right away. And so because of that, they're probably gradually losing. Certainly in foreign affairs, Charles Kupchan has written, we need a new strategy. Blinken has talked about negotiating with China over Russia. Even Ukraine is talking to China about negotiating there. And to be clear, by the way, like, I'm against the war. I don't think there should have been an invasion. I think, like, you know, I'm very sympathetic to innocent Ukrainians and so on who are getting blown up. I'm sympathetic to the Eastern Europeans who don't want to be reintegrated into the Russian Empire. I'm just saying, from the geopolitical perspective, did you see that editorial or op-ed or speech rather by Fiona Hill?
Yeah.
The national security person. Yes.
Yep.
Did you see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Pretty big deal.
So pretty big deal. This Leonard Mary lecture, Glenn Greenwald also noticed it. Very senior person in the blob, basically. Russiagate person, that kind of person. And she finally acknowledged what we've all known, which is I just want to quote it because it's such a remarkable document. Here we are. Might even put it on screen for a second. So can you see the screen?
Yep.
The Leonard Mary lecture, okay, by Fiona Hill. The Rest Rebellion Against the United States.
In the background, by the way?
It looks like him.
What am I supposed to take away from that?
I think it might be this guy named Leonard Mary, who's a much better guy, who's a first Estonian president. Striking resemblance. Funny you put it there, yeah. So essentially, Ukraine and the New World Order, the Rest Rebellion Against the United States, and she has, it's actually a very well-written article or speech, and there's a bunch of lines I could quote, but this is the most important. The war in Ukraine is perhaps the event that makes a passing of Pax Americana apparent to everyone. I mean, Americans are used to, America declaring its independence, but this is in reverse. The world is declaring its independence from America.
Yeah, I thought it was really striking that she went ahead and used the word rebellion. Really, all these notionally sovereign countries are rebelling against the United States?
That's right. And so essentially, all of those countries seek to cut the U.S. down to a different size in the neighborhoods and exert more influence in global affairs. We hear a resounding no to U.S. domination and see a market appetite for a world without a hegemon, right? And now, here's the thing, by the way, which I think is one of the most important conflicts actually on both the right and the left, the internal conflict. Because there are some people who are left status who think, the U.S. must spread democracy around the globe, or right status who really love the idea of having a powerful military, the America F yeah, kind of ideology. And I understand where that comes from. On the other hand, there are people on the left who will say, actually, this is more common in the past, but they still exist. Actually, the U.S. has been blowing up lots of countries and causing a lot of problems for people around the world. And it's not good that that is happening. And we're not spreading democracy at gunpoint in the Middle East by blowing up all these countries. And then conversely, there's folks on the right who say, America is too good for the world. Why is it going and having its soldiers and spending all this money trying to be the world's policeman? Why don't we take care of our home? Why are we not spending on the border? Or why are we not spending on our cities, et cetera? And so the left critique is America is doing bad abroad. The right critique is America isn't doing good at home, and it should be. So there's a split, right, where it's a republic versus an empire, and I think that I think the republic faction is going to win out for a variety of reasons, including, most importantly, there won't be enough money to maintain that empire. One way of thinking about it is in the whole competition with China. I'll show just two graphs actually on this to anchor, because I think people are really unrealistic on China.
Sure.
Maybe right. So let me just pull this up. So essentially, the thing that people think is they think, you can decouple from China, no problem, and it's a big problem. It's not easy to do that. It's not something where it's kind of like saying, I know the U.S. is not a manufacturing power anymore, but we can just start working out tomorrow and we'll be, really fit. It's not something that you can just rush like that. So here, let me just show you three quick graphs. So first, do you see the screen there?
Yep.
Yeah. So at the top, that is like which country was the number one partner of that country for trade. And you can see the U.S. was most countries in the world, and China just had like some countries in Central Asia or Africa in terms of where they shared greater trade. By 2020, most of the world is orange, meaning most of the world has their number one trade partner being the Chinese, and it's just accelerated over the last 3 years. Okay, so if you tell a country you need to decouple from China, and you have to choose between China and the U.S., that country doesn't want to do it. They certainly, they would certainly be reluctant to do it. But if they must choose, they would probably have to decouple from the U.S. And so if you force people to make that choice, the U.S. doesn't have the leverage that it thinks it does. That's really important to know. Then here, and this thread basically got like, a few million views because people were not aware of it. They're not being told this, right? Here is another one, okay? This is global steel production visualized. Can you see the screen there?
Yep.
So when people say, oh, Balaji, like the US will do the right thing after doing everything else, or it's just like the Malays of the 70s and we shrugged it off, and they'll kind of make these sort of vague historical analogies. The thing is, a historical analogy needs to be constrained by time series similarity. That's to say, you need to have some quantitative, some numbers that suggest that the period that you're entering now was quantitatively similar to the period before in terms of balance of power and so on, right? Rather than just saying, oh, we figured it out then, so we'll figure it out now. So, for example, this is like 1969, 1968, thereabouts. At that point, the US was making about 10x the steel of China. Today, it's 10x the other way. China's the number one steel manufacturer in the entire world, more than the rest of the world combined.
Yeah, that's really shocking.
And that's 100x turnaround. And I mentioned steel because it's a spinal column for a lot of other things, but it's not just steel. It's like, you probably heard like somebody like, talk about, oh, China doesn't have a blue water navy. That's all cope. China has the largest shipbuilding industry in the world. They do 100x what the US does. If they want to turn their plowshares into swords, they can. They're manufacturing. I mean, fighting China is like fighting your factory. They're like what the US was in 1945, just the manufacturing superpower of the world. And in any conventional war, they will out-execute you because they're set up to execute. I'm just being realistic here, right? This is like, it's something where, before you have two boxers get in a fight, you sort of want to make sure somebody's not going to get hurt,
Yeah, so thinking about this, and your remark that let's call them the imperialists are probably headed for trouble just because they can't finance their continued
oh yes, that gets to the third point.
Domination of the world, and
yeah, I'll show you
that just real quick, that put me in mind of it's kind of somewhat akin to the situation the British encountered during and after World War II, where they had the empire, they had the military, they weren't afraid to use it, they had a money problem, and in their case, they managed to squeak by, and made it through to the end of the war, and then the war's over, and they're like, well, we're just going to continue to be the world financial hegemon, right? And the U.S. sort of infamously, looked at these guys and they said, we're not going to do it that way anymore. It's going to be us now. That was a humiliation for them. There was food rationing in 1947, yes. Like just a few decades before the British invasion of the musical variety. London was still a very painful place to be. Huge reversal of fortune when they had to pull out of Greece. It was clear that they couldn't pay their own army anymore. That's where the Marshall Plan came from. The U.S. had to rush in. That's where NATO came from. Huge transformation of the global scene, even bigger in some ways than what happened when VE Day finally rolled around, or VJ Day. Yeah, the Axis was defeated, but the real foundations of the next world order were poured when the British ran out of money. So if that's the kind of thing that's going to happen to the U.S. or something that's a specter on the horizon, something that's already unfolding. That's something Americans are going to want to know about.
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely already unfolding. It is past tense in some ways. It's remarkable events are happening globally that are simply not getting the coverage in the U.S. I really do think that this is a 1989 style moment in some ways. Like, 1989, like the entire Soviet Union, like, just things started unwinding on the border of it, and then the whole thing came apart by 91.
Yeah, this is like Vladimir Putin's origin story, going from like watching the files get scattered out in the streets in '89 and thinking like, hey, wait a minute, there's Houston, we have a problem, and then fast forward to now, and that kind of changed. People just sort of think they're like, oh well, that was when America inevitably sort of triumphed over everything. That's not the kind of lesson history wants you to draw.
That's right, and in many ways, I think history is running in reverse. I mean, I showed you the China graph of them building all the steel, right? But here is what has America been accumulating over the last 40 years, a gigantic amount of debt relative to its revenue. Okay, so here's a graph of accumulated U.S. debt, and here's a graph of revenue. Now, the thing is, China also has accumulated a fair amount of debt. The difference is if you assume every stat on both sides is faked and you zero that out, China can build and the U.S. can't. Like the U.S. has, have you seen the Loss Umbrita thing?
Yeah.
You see lots of
not
snow?
in person, unfortunately. I can't seem to find one in LA, but I know they're out there.
Oh yeah, no. Well, like basically, just to kind of level set onto this, it's important to know this because if you think you're going to get in this huge competition or you're going to be able to win these like these essentially building competitions, you need to look at like how well you can build today, right? And I think here, let me show you some stuff, just to give like level set, right? Here we go. Can you see this? For the last 12 years, Blue America has been in total control of California. What is their greatest accomplishment in the field of public infrastructure? Is it this solar powered metal pole? Okay. Is it the toilet paper ribbon cutting where, this is a press conference for a solar, that is a bus shelter, supposedly. One person standing underneath something that doesn't even provide shelter, that has holes in it. So it doesn't provide shelter from the sun, doesn't provide shelter from the rain. You'll get rained on from the sides. And the entire thing was set up in such a way that one agency could build something without 8 other agencies vetoing it. Like the regulatory agency itself had to do, quote, regulatory arbitrage, the thing they complain about Uber and so on for doing. They now are finally forced to admit that it was necessary themselves. Okay. So the red tape is to the point that it's actually constraining other government bureaucracies. So all these people are looking at this thing as if it's like some great thing. Okay. So here is this pathetic thing. Here is toilet paper ribbon cutting. That's a state senator there. This is literally a whole press conference, just like the previous thing, for opening this one stall bathroom in BART, right? It's like, cargo cult, right? Where there's like an ancient civilization that built things, and people would come to the runway and they'd pray. This is like that. It's like an ancient civilization where this was like the moon landing for these guys, right? They could not build the BART system, or the cost of building it just keeps rising. So this opening up a bathroom after 20 years in San Francisco, they literally, do you see that? That's a toilet paper ribbon that they're cutting with their fingers.
Yeah, I see that guy on the far right who's almost jumping up and down trying to capture the moment on his phone. Well, history in the making.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, and it's really this ridiculous thing. Here's a third one: crack smoking billboard in San Francisco. Okay. Injecting drugs carries the highest risk of overdose, so try smoking or snorting instead. Let's take
that one I haven't seen.
Okay. You haven't seen this one. Oh, this is a whole set of billboards where it's harm reduction, where they have photos of homeless people talking about exactly how to use drugs. So San Francisco government, let's take care of each other, because of course, we need to be adults. People are just going to use hard drugs, so we can't stop them. So let's talk about exactly how to do this, right?
And that's like a full-size billboard. And then the fourth is,
it's full. Oh, it's not just one. It's a whole thing. Yes, there's a whole campaign on this, right? There's many of these billboards. Go look at if you want to. Harm reduction, no overdose, right? Okay. And then here, it took 27 years and $300 million bus line. Okay, 27 years. The thing is, once it goes from 27 years and 300 million to 100 years, okay, it just never gets built. And we're already there, right? That is to say, it's like getting slower and more expensive. And by the way, I was like, what is their greatest accomplishment in the field of public infrastructure? None of these is actually the greatest accomplishment. You know what it is? It's the $100 billion high-speed rail project where 15 years later, there's not a single mile of track laid.
Oh yeah, that was a classic.
Yes. Now, by contrast, again, when you zero it all out, basically, if you assume China also has debt and so on and so forth, which it does, right? The fundamental difference is China can build, because here we go. Here is 15 years later, there was nothing built in the US. Here's what it is in China. 2008 to 2020. How about that? Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah, I mean, what is there to say? You know, so you look at this stuff, and Americans look at this stuff, and they know, because they live in these towns, and they live in these communities, and they track what's going on in their state. They know that things aren't right. They know the numbers are upside down. They know that nothing ever really gets built, and if it gets built, it's probably garbage. The full faith and credit of the United States government supposedly backs the dollar, but what backs the full faith and credit of the United States government? And that's public opinion. That is, do the American people think that this money is real? And when you're looking around and you're pointing these things out, like, that little whisper starts to become a roar. So, do you think that that's the real tipping point, where just like the American people start going like, wait a minute, this is all make-believe, this is pretend? And if that's coming, it can be a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. What kind of steps should a responsible person take in order to not be right when it's too late?
Great question. So, by the way, one thing I want to make clear is, before I get to that, is when I point this stuff out, there's a good chunk of people who are like, oh my God, why do you hate America so much? Why are you such a doomer? Oh, we're going to figure it out, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, if you remember the America of the 50s and the 60s, when Sputnik happened, the reaction wasn't, oh my God, I can't believe you're such a Russian propagandist. Oh my God, like, obviously we're ahead. You don't believe in democracy, et cetera. Instead it was, okay, the Russians seem to have gotten ahead. We need to redouble our efforts on math and science. We're going to do them one better. We're going to land on the moon, and we're going to go all in, and so on, right? Now, I only bring that up because that is the spirit of how you respond to a challenge from a competitor. Is you don't say, oh, the competitor is going to die. Oh, the competitor sucks. Oh, we're morally superior. That's why we're losing. Some people will say, oh, China's communist, and we're a democracy, and that's why we can't build. Well, guess what? If the U.S. was nominally a democracy in the 1940s, it could build then. And China was certainly communist in the 1970s, and it couldn't build then. So the active ingredient is not democracy versus communist. It's not even a modern democracy, because I could show you other visuals. India, of all places, is now able to build. India's able to build a parliament building for 125 million in 2 years, which is crazy. They built a rail system. It's built there's an amazing thing in my lifetime that's happened. And so it's not about communism, democracy. It's not about modern versus older. It's about like kind of the spirit of the civilization, frankly. So now, to your point, as I said, I think we're on the verge of like a Soviet-style collapse, honestly. Foreigners aren't buying treasuries anymore. They're buying gold. Let me show you some graphs on that, because that makes a point. So hold this up. And then let's get to, because I want to show you that I'm not like just, I try to have graphs for everything I'm saying, so that you can see. I'm not just like, go ahead.
Proof of work. Let's see it.
Proof of work. That's right. Okay, here we go. So I'll show you two more graphs. Ready? This shows, do you see foreign holders of U.S. treasuries as a percent of total debt?
Yep.
Okay. Basically, the way it works is kind of as follows. If you were a Chinese manufacturer, you would put your toys in Walmart. Okay. You would get, Americans would buy it at Walmart, and Walmart would send you back dollars. Okay. For those toys. You would then go and exchange those dollars with the Chinese government, and you'd have renminbi, and then you'd go and buy, stuff locally in China. Or you have yuan rather, and you'd buy it locally in China. The Chinese government now would have a bunch of dollars because it just managed to exchange. And what would it do? It would take those dollars and it would normally buy treasuries from the USA, recycling the dollars and sending them back. And so essentially what would happen is the Chinese government would save in US treasuries. That was the relationship that went on for decades, okay, where they trusted the US enough to use the US as their bank effectively. With me so far? All right. And lots of countries did that. Not anymore. They're not saving in treasuries. They have started reducing their foreign holdings of treasuries. They started reducing it in about 2013, a few years after the financial crisis. It's now at the lowest level in 19 years. This is in 2022. It's going to drop further since then. Okay. And what are they buying instead? Gold. Gold is up and to the right. Kaboom. Okay. So why gold? Because that's an alternative to buying treasuries rather than saving. Everybody who bought treasuries in 2021, it's very technical as to what exactly happened. But the short version is the asset that was marketed as the safest asset in the world, much like mortgages or mortgage-backed securities were in the 2000s. By the way, mortgage-backed securities are also toxic waste in this cycle. That's a whole separate topic. But basically, the treasuries that the government sold in 2021, it mass devalued in 2022. Okay.
Yeah,
basically,
let me pause you on let me pause you on gold real quick. I know that a lot of people watch the number. It kind of wiggles around. Sort of a belief that the U.S. banks are more or less stopping people from getting rich off of gold. There's an awareness that other countries are sort of scooping it up. Can you just quickly quantify just exactly how much demand has gone up worldwide for gold, how that's reflected?
Yeah. Well, just look at that graph, right? Basically that is that is showing essentially that's the last 20 something years, and you could see that central banks were net sellers, and starting around here they started to become net buyers, and now it spiked to all-time highs. And 2023 will just shatter this chart.
Okay, so we're using a lot of roughly about double what it has been, with a few up and downs over the past decade or so.
Yes, but it's I think this is not where the bar. I think the bar will be here or something like that in 2023. Yes, I'm looking at parabolic, and it's basically Russia, China, India in particular that are buying a lot. And what's interesting is it's the non-Western countries, because Western countries believe in fiat and they believe in the entire G7 system and so on and so forth. It's non-Western countries, those that have the most social distance in a sense from Blue America. Those are the ones that are doing this, right? And basically, I want to show you another article. Or graph. Okay. So de-dollarization, okay, is happening at a quote stunning pace. All right. Here, there's so many countries. There's different ways of looking at this. This is a presentation itself. Do you see that de-dollarization is happening at a stunning pace? Jen says, okay. You see that? Here's a graph of that. Basically, the share of dollars relative to other currencies, people are just reducing their exposure quite rapidly. And this was as of Q2 of last year. That's about a year ago, and it's dropping even further since then.
And they can do so in a number of different ways here, right? So it's not just you have to trade one for the other. So this could be like a death by a thousand cuts kind of scenario pretty fast.
Yeah, and the thing is, by the way, the graph that I just showed was them using the dollar as a financial asset, as a whether it's they're saving in treasuries or other things, but as a mechanism for trade. Again, the whole thing knits together, because if China is the number one trade partner of most of the world, they can just send yuan to China now. And one of the big things that's happened over the last couple of months is China's finally learned diplomacy. And so they've done deals with not just Russia and Iran for trading in yuan, but with Saudi Arabia and with Brazil and with even France and a lot of the Central Asian countries and a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, and certainly a lot of African countries. China's just rolling up the chessboard here. And some of those countries are trading in yuan with China, but some of them also want to trade in their own local currencies locally. So ASEAN is 10 Southeast Asian nations, like Indonesia, Malaysia, et cetera. ACU is Central Asian nations, all the stands, the former, Russian stands. And they're all having meetings where they're yeah, we need to de-dollarize. Why do we need to de-dollarize? Not because they hate the U.S., because they're we don't want to have, first, we don't have our assets frozen, like what happened to Russia. And second is we don't know what's going to happen with the U.S., so let's use our own currencies instead, right? And that's happening everywhere. Brazil sent a delegation of 100 people to meet with, the leader of Brazil, Lula, went to China, but brought 100 Brazilian businessmen and so on to build greater trade ties. And so that's a financial. You're seeing all these countries kind of rebelling against U.S. order, U.S. leadership. There's also what I don't know if you call it the military, the political, but for example, Iranian warships or Iranian ships were docking in Brazil. You had a senator who was yelling at Japan because they had arrested an American serviceman. Another senator or congressman, I think, who was saying that the U.S. should blow up TSMC in Taiwan. if in a situation where China might take it, and then Taiwan said, no, we'll shoot at a U.S. plane if it tries to blow up TSMC. You have another example where senators or congressmen were yelling at Germany for not building its military enough. And she's starting to see something where it's not just the normal Russia, China, Iran that are disobeying, like U.S. orders. It's Germany, it's France saying that wants strategic autonomy, it's Brazil, it's Taiwan, it's even Japan, right? And that's why I compare this to 1989, where the cracks appeared in the Warsaw Pact first, the Eastern European satellites of the Soviet Union, and then it came to the Union itself. And now what's happening is all of these countries that were under the US thumb are now finding they can break away and defy. I mean, have you followed what's been happening in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean,
what's going on there?
It's true enough that that the pattern is there. It certainly seems like the Feds are really motivated to prevent a kind of splitting or fracturing at home. You look at what's going on with Binance, Coinbase, SEC, Treasury, Fed. They're all trying to crack down as fast as they can to prevent that kind of disintegration from happening.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So basically, the thing is, the reason that the whole thing is one kind of integrated picture is Blue America is losing control abroad and at home. It's all one global network. And so all these countries, so just what's going on in the Middle East, for example, and I'll come back to the Coinbase Binance point, is just off the top of my head, China signed a peace treaty, surprise, incredible thing between Saudi and Iran. So Saudi, Iran, and China are all on the same side, selling oil to China in yuan. There's a peace treaty between Saudi and Yemen. There's effectively peace between Assad and the Arab League. There's something where the U.S. didn't want Saudi to make peace with Iran. Burns went over to Saudi and he's like, why are you doing that? The U.S. didn't want the Arab League to make peace with Assad. They said they'll sanction Arab countries that do that. Didn't matter. Those countries just disobeyed and said, okay, go and do that. It doesn't matter. And so now there's, quote, in a sense, peace in the Middle East, which is this incredible thing that hasn't happened before. And the U.S. is basically being pushed out of the region. And there's even talk of like a joint navy there, which China contributes to, that would essentially have contributions from all of the countries there to, quote, keep it stable, which is obviously a non-U.S. thing. And that's like remarkable because the petrodollar was another big bulwark of the dollar, that oil was sold in dollars. Oil is now sold in yuan, and all those countries are on the side of China. And probably not every deal is being discussed publicly. MBS, basically the issue is Blue America hates everybody. Everybody's a fascist, right? Like, and that's not just Trump is a fascist and DeSantis is a fascist. They hate, obviously they hate Russia, they hate China, but they hate Saudi, they hate India, they hate Israel, they hate Hungary. Macron has criticized wokeness, so they're mad at him, right? South Africa actually said that they are, like reasonably pro, or like neutral or something like that. They're not going to arrest Putin on their soil. Mm-hmm. So now you're seeing negative press on South Africa here, right? And on, right? So the point is, like, Blue America has actually lost the art of diplomacy. And so the reason I just pointed to all this foreign policy stuff is that is like the base for the dollar. It's this global system. So all of these customers are bailing on the dollar because the dollar, it's not just a piece of paper. You know what it is, James?
Tell me.
The dollar's a network.
Yeah.
Okay. It's literally a network. And it's a network like a social network, except it's a financial network. And so it has a network effect. Okay. Except all these countries are now reverse bandwagoning. And something to also keep in mind, by the way, is if you've traveled, over the last 15 years, what's happened is many countries have payment systems, both consumer and enterprise, that are more sophisticated technologically than the legacy US system. It's not just WeChat in China. It's something called UPI in India. And it's like GrabPay in Southeast Asia. And, there's Yandex Money in Russia and basic PagSeguro and so on in Brazil. Essentially, there's both consumer, there's Alipay, right? There's both consumer and enterprise payment apps. And there's millions of people in fintech and crypto globally, hundreds of millions of crypto holders. And so for the last 15 years, there's this enormous reservoir of competence in standing up new financial systems and new currencies and new financial technologies. And so the only thing that whereas in the US, you have still have like the ACH wire SWIFT system, the only thing it has going for it is incumbency. It's not better technologically. It's not same day payments. It's not programmable like crypto. It's not public like that. It also doesn't have the huge manufacturing economy of China to back it.
Well, and we know that this is all happening at a time when competence in America is on the decline. I mean, you can measure it however you want, but people know that it's going on at the local level all the way up to the top of the chain.
That's right. So you have something where the world would not choose, like, an order is stable if everybody chooses it again from scratch, they'd choose the same person to be the leader, right? In a sense, kind of what happened after 1971, but especially after 1991, is the US sort of promoted itself to CEO of the world. So it doesn't make things with its own hands anymore. Instead, what it exported was rule of law and a currency system and like effectively police. Okay, so it's like the international rules-based order and a combination of sanctions and military to keep the system. And then and basically because it was respected by everybody wanted to send their kids to the US to study and whatnot. It was able to essentially fight everywhere or win everywhere without fighting. Okay, in 1991, the US could win everywhere without fighting. Now it's fighting everywhere without winning. Over 30 years, it's slowly eroded that position. And the issue is, it's like a revolt against the CEO of the world because that CEO is no longer providing stability. They're providing chaos. And why is everybody in the world giving the US a cut of every transaction, which is what the dollar is? Why don't they just use their own currency now that they've got the technology and the capability to stand that up, right? It's not trivial to launch a currency, but it's take it from someone who's done both. It's much easier to launch currencies than to scale factories. Okay. So that's a foreign perspective. All right, now bringing it back to domestic. Fundamentally, what I think is happening with Blue America, and this is actually the hopeful case, is it's going to have more power over fewer people. Okay, and that actually reconciles a number of different lenses. They are getting tighter and tighter in their constriction, and they're pushing really hard to have power. But they're trying it. They've inherited something that they can never build. And so when they push really hard, less with Ukraine, Russia, everybody they're not pushing on, pulls away as a consequence. It makes sense, right?
Yeah, it makes sense. So that's what's happening globally. Is your bet on more power or less people?
It's more power over fewer people. That is to say, everybody who's still in Blue America's sphere of influence, right? Like blue states, like the Canadians, or at least the blue Canadians, all the blue people in the G7, because think of it as a network, right? The blue network is everybody who still trusts treasuries, Biden, all that stuff, right? That is probably 100 million, 200, I don't know exactly how many 100 million people, but it's like a good chunk of people around the world. But it's not everybody. In fact, it's not even a majority within the US anymore. And you can sense that even just on social media. Now that you have uncensored social media, blues will defend their own political candidates, but they can't do search and destroy anymore. Right?
Okay, so it sounds like what you're saying is basically if red teamers want to make sure that they don't get stuck in a blue team world, which is going to shrink, but is going to be
local governments
is going to be tighter. Then they're going to need gray team in order to build out the kind of infrastructure or to have the kind of institutional competence needed to give them a place to go to as Team Blue falls down.
That's right. So here's the thing. So basically, let me just talk about that for a second. Gray Tribe, which is tech, and Scott Alexander has named it. And of course, you can do like a 4-tribe, 5-tribe, 6-tribe, whatever model. Just take 3 tribes for now, okay? Blue tribe, red tribe, gray tribe. Tech is not that numerous, but it's extremely influential. And the thing is, red tribe on its own, what's a Republican Hollywood? I don't know, some guys on 4chan making memes. Or what's a Republican Harvard? Is it Bob Jones University, right?
I think it's updated to Hillsdale now, yeah.
Yeah. So no offense, right? But basically, it's on the same weight class, right? However, if you start saying, okay, Harvard and Hollywood are the blue versions, and the gray versions are AI tutors and YouTube and Coursera for education. That's actually better than Harvard in many ways. Harvard students themselves use that instead, and Harvard itself has dropped off. What's a gray Hollywood? Well, again, it's YouTube, it's Netflix, and so on. Again, Netflix and so on has dropped off recently, but it's like online media, social media, that's more persuasive than Hollywood. And so the gray version is better than the blue version. The blue version is sucking wind and losing to the gray version. And partly it's because the gray version, gray Americans are only partially Americans. They're really like a global tribe with a projection into the US, because tech is like a global movement. And many of those people are immigrants and so on. And so they have a fundamentally global perspective. And that means they can draw strength from abroad. They can draw users from abroad. They can draw money from abroad. They can draw talent from abroad. And, I'm sympathetic to the red American, but red Americans fundamentally, many of them still think they're strong, right? They still think that, they don't need any help from abroad. They can win against the blues by themselves. And, Ben Franklin, he was as patriotic as it gets. And Ben Franklin understood that the only way that they were going to beat the British was to get the help of the French at that time.
Yeah, there's been a huge underdog culture on the red team for a long time, and they've earned it and everything. But it's just undeniable how the founders squared the circle when they were being pushed to the brink.
Yeah, and the reason I say this is there's a fair number of people who are Republicans or a red team because they sort of like the idea of the U.S. being big and strong and powerful and number one and the biggest and strongest military, and how dare you insult it, and so on and so forth, right? And you have to kind of, I think, I shouldn't say abandon that, but just realize that it's not as true anymore. I kind of abandon it, like in the sense that I could show similar things, just like on the construction stuff. You can observe that the U.S. can't build, in terms of buildings, but it also has very, very expensive military buildouts, right? Like just to make that point, let me come back to the thing here. If you look at the same kind of government spending and over budget and whatnot stuff is here. Take a look at this. You see the screen there?
Uh-huh.
Right. So it's not just 20 years to reopen a public bathroom. It's 1.7 trillion for a manned jet in an age of drones, the F-35, right? That reportedly doesn't even work. Here's the Zumwalt, only 3 were ever delivered. The U.S. Navy's great stealth destroyer failure. Okay. Here is the little combat ship. The cost overruns, delays, mechanical failures. Each of the 23 ships cost around $500 million to build with astronomical operating costs. The list goes on. The Navy's $13 billion supercarrier still can't do the one thing it's absolutely required to do. What good is an aircraft carrier that can't reliably launch and land aircraft? So that's like, the Ford-class aircraft carrier, that's a little combat ship, that's the Zumwalt, that's the F-35. Look, I'm not a military expert, but I do fund hardware and software. And when you're seeing these huge flagship programs and the recurring thing is how astronomically over budget they are, how expensive they are, that means that the state is not good at capital allocation. Okay. And if you're spending $1,000 on an orange juice, it doesn't matter if you were really rich, you will become poor. You know what I'm saying? Like if you're constantly spending 300 million on a bus lane and somebody else is spending $1 million on it, it doesn't matter if you're rich, you will become poor because you just can't control your costs. And that's what's happened, right? So you should think about it not in a sense. That's the thing that the red American, I can reduce it to 2 premises, and let's talk Coinbase Binance and allocation. So it basically boils down to 2 premises. You know what those 2 premises are?
Hit me.
So it's basically these, and it's amazing. I did this poll and I was amazed at the results of the poll. Okay, here's the poll. Can the U.S. print infinite money? And does the U.S. have an invincible military? Okay. And I was stunned by the results of this poll, honestly. First, now, of course, what that really means is print infinite money without consequence. Okay. But can it print infinite money? 26% were saying yes. 10% thinks it has an invincible military. 20% think yes to both. And only 45%, 44% of my followers say no to both. Okay. So this is like the left statist. They think the US can print infinite money without consequence. This is like the right statists who are like US military big and strong. Okay. But actually, these two premises are equivalent. You know why?
Well, these things are interchangeable at a certain point. You can't have one without the other.
Yeah, because like fiat currency is backed by men with guns, right? Like basically, you know, there's this famous clip where Paul Krugman says exactly that. Fiat currency is backed by men with guns, right? Literally, that's what he says. So, and the reason they're equivalent is if you can print infinite money, you can buy all the military gear and personnel you need. Conversely, if you have an invincible military, you can force anyone to accept your printed currency. Okay. So it all snaps together where if China is the factory of the world and they can build more arms and they can out manufacture the US, and even if Russia is seemingly fighting the US to a standstill, China is easily 10x Russia. Russia's fighting NATO to a standstill, evidently, right? Then China's stronger. So it doesn't have an invincible military. It cannot compel people militarily. And it doesn't have an infinitely powerful currency because all these countries are pulling away from it, right? So that means that those two premises that 55% of my followers still don't get, right? Only 45% have really modeled out the world where the US has neither an infinite printer nor infinite bomber. Okay.
Right.
So you have to start there where the US is constrained. Bolivia doesn't think it can print infinite money and has an invincible military. All countries other than the US do not think this, right? So you have to start there where the superpowers are gone. Kryptonite is hit. Okay. And that's a huge come down for people. Many people will not want to reason forward from here because they will have one or both of those two premises since they've seen so many Hollywood movies, right? All these Hollywood movies, you know, Independence Day or Transformers or something, right? The US military is literally saving the world from aliens. It's like portrayed as being super powerful. Remember Contagion?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know.
Right?
I think that in spite of all those movies, I think some of the shine is starting to wear off. People are getting a little bit more realistic. We got about 3 minutes left here,
yes.
So I want to make sure that we hit on on Binance, Coinbase, and then I want to close out talking about the spirit of a civilization.
Absolutely. And so the thing is, TLDR is what you should think about is the dollar is now on very uncertain terrain, and you should think about allocation, location, organization. Allocation is what do you allocate into financially. Nothing I say is financial advice. Do what you want to do. But what a lot of smart people are doing is they're getting into what's outside money. Outside money is, it could be literally physical bars of gold. It could be Bitcoin. Maybe it's another cryptocurrency that you like. But I think gold and Bitcoin will be Schelling points. Gold is a Schelling point for a lot of central banks, Bitcoin for a lot of tech people. Okay. It could be foreign fiat currency that you think is stable. Who knows what those are, but it's just basically the farther away you are from blue America. If you must be within the Anglo world, Australia and New Zealand are probably pretty good. Those are being chosen by a lot of, wealthy folks around the world. The second point is actually more important than allocation. 2008 was a crisis that was a financial crisis. 2023 to 2025, I think, is more like a fiat crisis. Location is more important than allocation. You want to be in a place where you trust the people around you. And ideally, you know your neighbors. And that means probably getting out of a blue state if you can. Get to a red state, get to a foreign country that is stable. Not any foreign country, obviously, but there's going to be stable foreign countries. And then the third is organization, which is build a community organization when you get to that place, because the ultimate store of value is a high trust community. It's not just the money, it's about knowing the people around you. And, that's like the old school thing of, knocking on your neighbor's door and holding a bake sale with them and knowing the 20 people around you and like rebuild community that way. If you want to start it online, you certainly can do it with a Discord or a group chat, keep people in sync, right? But knowing your neighbors and being in a community where they're organized will be quite helpful in the event of stress, right? So it's allocation, location, organization. Now I recognize people will think, oh, I can't move out of a blue state and so on and so forth. I get that. All I just say is at least think about allocation then. It's up to you.
Yeah,
and you
can
talk
try.
about spirit. Go ahead.
No,
Yes.
that's it. I mean, look, we could go on. I'd like to come back and finish this off. That's literally all the time I've got on the clock here. So let's put a pin in it. I think what you said about the spirit of a civilization is really important. I know in the past we've talked about you seeing people putting the cross emoji into their Twitter bio, new ways of signaling, and that stuff runs pretty deep. And when the cracks start to appear and what people have taken for granted for a long time, that kind of spiritual energy can really surge forth. So let me just thank you now for coming on, and hopefully we can do the sequel here and get to the rest of the stuff. It's really good stuff, and people need to know what's coming down the pike. Until next time, Balaji Srinivasan, thanks for joining us. For the rest of you, to become a Blaze TV subscriber and help us create more content like this, go to blazetv.com and use the code 0hour20 for $20 off your first year of Blaze TV. That was Balaji Srinivasan. This is 0 Hour. I'm James Poulos. May God have mercy on us all.